Ethics Untangled is made by the Idea Centre at the University of Leeds. It's a podcast about the difficult ethical questions we face in everyday life. In each episode, I interview someone, usually a philosopher, who's spent time thinking through one of these questions, and we try between us to work out what's going on. For this episode, I spoke to Wendy Salkin, who's a philosopher based at Stanford University. We were talking about the ethics of informal political representation. Informal political representatives are people who speak and advocate in the political sphere on behalf of some cause without holding political office. Famous examples of informal political representatives include Martin Luther King Jr., Malala Yousafzai, and Greta Thunberg. Informal political representatives often do really important work in raising awareness of issues and bringing about political change, and they often achieve things that people with more formal power are unable or unwilling to do. But their existence also raises some ethical questions. Where do they get their authority from? Are they accountable? What if the things they say diverge from the views of the people they represent? Professor Salkin has written a book on this subject. It's called Speaking for Others, and it comes out on July the 9th. In this conversation, we explored some of the key topics covered in it. Wendy, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me, Jim. It's wonderful to be here.
So we're here to talk about informal political representatives and the ethical issues that arise in the context of informal political representation. So first, we might as well start by saying what is an informal political representative? How are you defining that? And can you give some examples so that might become clear for our listeners?
Sure. Yeah. So an informal political representative is an individual or a group who is treated by an audience as speaking or acting for others on matters apt for broad public discussion, despite having been neither elected nor selected to do so by means of a systematized election or selection procedure.
Right.
I have a slightly more precise formulation that I will share with you. It's a party R informally represents a group G in context C, just in case two conditions are satisfied. Okay. So the first is the audience conferral condition. So some audience A treats party R as speaking or acting for group G in context C. So that's the audience conferral condition. The second condition is the authorizational informality condition, which is that party R was selected not by means of a systematized election or selection procedure. I can say a little more about that, or if you want to, I have some examples that I'm happy to.
I think examples would be helpful, just to kind of bring that to life and make it clear what people mean. But I suppose it's first to say what we're not talking about is formal political representatives. So, I mean, and the most obvious kinds of cases of formal political representatives would be in this country, something like an MP, where you are, a representative or a senator or something like that, right? Those are formal political representatives, and we're not talking about those. We're talking about the informal kind. But yeah, if you could give some examples, that would be great.
Sure. Yeah. So who are some examples? So in the book that I've just completed, that's coming out in July, Speaking for Others, I discuss Booker T. Washington, who was an informal political representative for Black Americans, as well as the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who was an informal political representative for Black Americans. Some more contemporary examples include Me Too movement leader Tarana Burke, who informally represents survivors of sexual assault, abuse, and harassment. Greta Thunberg, who's an informal representative of Gen Z, particularly concerning matters of climate change. And then Malala Yousafzai, an informal political representative of Pakistani school children.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Those are interesting examples and kind of varied, I suppose. One thing that leaps out about that is that the kind of group that those people are representing could be quite sort of I could be quite distinct and, a relatively small number of people, or it could be huge. It could be like the whole of Gen Z in the Greta Thunberg example. That is a vast number of people. Right. But there is always some distinct group, right? You can't be a political representative for everyone.
I don't think it is conceptually impossible on my account that because of the audience conferral condition, so if there is some audience that took you, Jim, to speak for all of us, then in that context, with respect to that audience, you would be the informal representative of all of us. It doesn't seem like it's going to amount to much unless it turns out that party that's conferred the status on you is themselves quite powerful. But I don't think that's not the central case, and it doesn't seem like it gets at either the interesting features of this phenomenon or the concerns about it. And I just want to add one thing, that all of those examples I've given all have in common is that they've been serving as informal representatives over time. They've developed relationships with their informal constituencies. They've built social movements, the norms of which inform how they represent. But I want to clarify that on this view, not all informal political representatives are internationally recognized movement leaders, right? So it could just be our neighbor who happened to go to the city council meeting to give voice to some shared interests of people living in our neighborhood. But when they get to the mic to give their 3 minutes of public comment, the city council may treat them as speaking for our whole neighborhood, and they thereby become our informal political representative.
Right. And an example that springs to mind actually in the UK context is, I don't know whether you kind of get this over your way, but we've had recently a big scandal in the post office where the post office was taking postmasters to court for supposedly embezzling money, where actually it was an IT error that was the source of the problem. So, a lot of people were taken to court. It's a big scandal. It's been taking up a lot of time in the media recently, but in that case, and actually there was a drama about it on TV here, which kind of raised the profile of it quite a lot.
And the kind of what I'm going to watch today.
Yeah, it's worth watching. And the central character in that drama was a guy, I think he's called Alan Bates, and he kind of took this case on. He was himself a sub postmaster in the post office, but he kind of took this role on behalf of all these other people who'd been implicated in this scandal, and kind of tried to make their voices heard and tried to get some kind of redress, and over a period of years, I think eventually. But yeah, it was an informal role because it was kind of, he just de facto became the voice of those people because he kind of took that he just took that position, and they were happy for him to do so. But there was no selection process. It's not like he was ever kind of voted in or anything like that, I suppose.
Yeah, and that's an interesting case, and I hesitate to speak on cases about which I'm not familiar, but I will say that a feature of my view, as it would sort of apply here, is that he becomes an informal political representative for that group when and because the various audiences before which he's speaking and acting treat him as speaking and acting for that group, not because of his sort of self-appointment. So thinkers like Laura Montanaro and Michael Sayward and Andrew Rayfeld all have really interesting views on non-electoral representatives and similar phenomena, but they seem to locate the concern, specifically Laura Montanaro, on whether the person is self-appointed. And so something that I think about a little bit differently is that I think the condition for whether somebody emerges into this role is anyone listening to you? Is anyone relying on what you say to learn about what the group wants? That audience conferral moment is what makes, in this case, Bates the representative.
That's interesting. And I suppose that could kind of be a fluid situation, right? That could be something that changes over time. And you could be in a position where it's fluctuating a bit, where like some of the people who you're seeking to represent do see you as, legitimately occupying that role, and some might be slightly starting to lose trust or whatever, and where kind of your occupation of that role becomes a bit of a grey area potentially.
Yes, I think a few things to say on this point. One is that the audience that confers the status does not need to be, it can, but does not need to be the group that you represent. So I might take you to be the informal representative of all podcasters. I am not myself a podcaster, but I have now put you in that position with respect to all podcasters. And so that raises lots of concerns, right? About non-group member parties being able to put a representative into a sometimes consequential role for a group that may not want them in that role. It's certainly also fluid in the way that you described, right? The sort of out of context and with respect to one audience means that there can be widely various views on who is the informal representative. I'm not committed to the claim that there can only be one. In fact, I think it's a great strength of informal political representation that there can be many informal political representatives for a group, which is not as often a feature of formal political representation, where there can be sort of more strictly codified limits on who speaks or acts for, say, Californians.
Yeah, I see. Good. Okay. So I think we've got a handle on what an informal political representative is then. Next question is, why might that be a valuable thing to have? What do informal political representatives do that's valuable?
I think that they do all sorts of valuable things. For instance, they can voice a group's otherwise neglected interests, either supplementing a group's existing formal political representation by giving voice to interests that those formal representatives fail to express, or by serving as the lone voice for groups that altogether lack formal political representatives.
Right.
So in the book, I discuss people and organizations that serve as informal political representatives for groups like prisoners and the undocumented who are excluded from the electorate, and so have to rely on either virtual representation or informal political representation to have their interests publicly expressed. I think they can also make overlooked groups visible, right? So making a government or broader public aware that there are groups whose interests ought to be weighed in political decision-making. They can raise group consciousness and contribute to group formation, right? So some people are members of groups and have common interests, but don't see it that way. They might either not realize individually that they have those interests themselves, or they might realize they have those interests, but not view them as shared. So a representative can represent members of a group to itself as a group, right? Thereby about group consciousness and group formation. And they can also serve as communicative conduits between the represented group and then lawmakers or the media or the broader public. For instance, ABM, which is the shack dwellers movement in South Africa, communicates between judiciaries and South African shack dwellers. And here I want to credit Whitney K. Taylor and Kira Tate, who political scientists whose work brought this example to my attention. In a few cases, representatives can even negotiate on the group's behalf, as Dr. King did in Montgomery, Alabama, when negotiating between bus boycotters, the bus company, and the city of Montgomery.
Right.
So, and then in each of the roles I've just described, they might also play a sort of role of educator, right? Educating an audience about the group. So I could go on about the different sort of valuable roles they play, but I think they have a lot to offer in many contexts.
Yeah, good. Okay, yeah. But you highlight some potential worries as well about informal political representatives. So why might we worry about them and the kinds of things that they do?
There are lots of reasons to worry about informal political representatives. To begin, one of the fundamental features of informal political representation is that the representatives are not subject to traditional authorization and accountability mechanisms available in formal political representative contexts. As a result, informal political representatives can have outsized control over the public narratives of the groups they represent without the represented having much recourse to impose institutional or other procedural reprisals.
Right.
And I should say, for the most part, informal representatives don't receive authorization from those they represent. But I do think there are some cases in which they might receive something like informal authorization or ratification. So in the third chapter of the book on group authorization, I look at the Montgomery bus boycott example, which I think of as a rare but clear case in which an informal representative, namely King, received informal authorization from bus boycotters to serve as their spokesperson and negotiator during the boycott. But again, that's a relatively rare case of informal authorization.
Okay.
There are some other concerns too, right? They're difficult to hold accountable. They can't be impeached, can't be voted out of office, they can't be formally sanctioned. And it's true that they can be subject to less formal reprisals, right? Protest, dissent, cancellation, but those aren't codified and reliable, repeatable accountability mechanisms. And so such mechanisms, even if they would be effective in a particular case, depend on the represented group's members being able to voice their objections to an informal political representative or an audience independently of their informal political representative. But in many cases, the groups that have informal political representatives rely on them for their opportunities to engage in public expressions of grievance, meaning that it can be really hard for the members of those groups to effectively communicate those grievances about their informal political representative without the representative's aid.
Right. Okay. Yeah, good. So to kind of summarize that, I suppose there's a problem of authority, right? There's a problem of authorization. So there's no formal mechanism through which these people are kind of voted in or, elected or whatever. And therefore there's a question about where they derive their authority from, where what gives them the right, I suppose, to speak on behalf of these groups. And is that right? Is that a fair summary?
That is not the way. So that's not the way I frame the question.
Okay.
Partly because I don't think, right. So because I don't think that authorization is feasible in most cases of informal representation. I find that that's not the most helpful way for me to frame the ethical question, right? And so the way I think many people would be inclined to think about it that way, and thereby kind of model it on the structure of, well, what makes formal representation okay when it's okay? It's because they can be authorized and held accountable. Here we have to sort of turn to a different way of thinking about the rule. So my initial description of the rule is it's a descriptive account of this role as it manifests in society like ours, right? In describing that sort of audience conferral condition, I'm not endorsing that that's how it ought to be. I'm saying this is a feature of our social environment. This is how people do come into this role. We can look at that role and people in it and say, wow, it seems like sometimes they do really valuable things. Sometimes they do really concerning things, or what they do has concerning consequences. Given that authorization is not possible in most of these cases, given that they're hard to hold accountable, what are the responsibilities of individual people or individual parties in that role? Given the right? So the question, it's not that there's no question of authority. It's that it's not the first or most important question. And so a lot of my work is to try and think about, well, what do these representatives owe to the groups for whom they speak or act, particularly in cases where they are willing to be in the role, right?
Okay, good. Yeah. So you're primarily focused on this question of what individuals who occupy this role, how they should think about their responsibilities towards the people they represent and so on. And it's more that rather than kind of what are the sort of structural mechanisms of accountability or whatever that we might ideally want, given that those can't really exist in most of these cases, right?
That's right.
It's kind of non-ideal cases, isn't it? Ideally, you would want there to be more formal kind of authority, but it's just not going to happen like that in these cases.
I don't reject the value of having authorization mechanisms or accountability mechanisms, but I share with someone like Hannah Pitkin in concept of representation a certain maybe skepticism or inquiry about whether that's the best or only way to think about representation and what happens within representation, right? So I don't think of this phenomenon as a second best solution or a sort of defective case of formal political representation, right? I think that formal political representation is a phenomenon with which we're well familiar, about. There's been a lot of serious thinking. Informal political representation shares a lot of features in common. The way that I think about it is actually that there's a space of political representation, and there are four sort of different considerations along which something that, a particular instance of representation could be more or less formal, right? So it could be authorizationally more or less formal. The accountability structures could be more or less formal. The type of group being represented might be more likely to be represented formally or informally. And then the norms in accordance with which we evaluate the representation, right? What we think looks like good representation in the context, can be more or less formalized in terms of whether they're codified somewhere, right? In a set of laws, for instance. But I don't. So representation can kind of be in any one part of that broad space, according to at least those four considerations. And I don't think of informality as by itself a bad making feature of the representation, right? Yeah. I think it's it's more nuanced than that, perhaps.
Okay, sure. So to turn to this question of what the duties of these individuals are, then, one thing that you might ask about informal political representatives is whether they accurately represent the views and interests of the people that they seek to represent. Do they always do that, in your view?
No, I do not think that they always do that. Because of the way that informal political representatives emerge, sometimes unwittingly or unwillingly, it's hard to say that we should even always expect this of them. Of course, with respect to those who are voluntarily informal political representatives, right, people who have put themselves forth as someone willing to be in the role, and then an audience, right, for that reason confers the status on them, I think it's reasonable to expect a higher standard of accuracy. But I should add that this is a concern that's not unique to informal political representatives, right? The concern about political representatives failing to accurately represent the views and interests of those they represent are concerns common to both formal and informal political representation. Another consideration about accuracy is this: although we might, of course, think that it would be best if informal and formal political representatives alike aim to find out the views and interests of those they represent, that's different from saying that they should in all cases try to give full, accurate expression to those views and interests, right? Political representatives of all stripes are generally in the business of representing groups, not individuals, and groups have members, and the members of those groups will often have views and interests that are widely divergent from their fellow group members' interests and views. So even in the best cases, political representatives, whether they're formal or informal, are going to need to make difficult and sometimes divisive decisions about which views and which interests to express.
Yeah. I mean, I guess it's at least potentially possible or conceptually possible that the views of these people about their interests might diverge from their interests, right? So it might be that the person who's representing the interests of a group might have a slightly different view of what those interests are from members of that group themselves. And as you say, they're not going to be homogeneous, so they're going to have different views. But yeah, I mean, it's just to say that it's potentially quite a complicated picture, right, for these people.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think what might help is to give an example to just kind of crystallize how kind of complex these ethical issues can be. So the case that I found really interesting in the paper that you wrote about this was the one about Booker T. Washington. So I just wondered if you could tell us a bit about that case and why that's interesting as an example of informal political representation.
Sure. So Booker T. Washington, right, famously gave what has come to be called the Atlanta Compromise speech at the 1895 Cotton States and International Exposition. There, he made some fairly controversial public concessions that were treated by many, including President Theodore Roosevelt, as made on behalf of Black Americans. So he said things like, and I'm quoting him here, "The wisest among my race understand that the agitation of questions of social equality is the extremest folly." He made this promise to white Southerners. He says, "I pledge that in your effort to work out the great and intricate problem which God has laid at the doors of the South, you shall have at all times the patient, sympathetic help of my race." So those are some pretty striking concessions. And I'm not here expressing my own view about whether Washington should or should not have made them. On Washington's political philosophy, I have learned a lot from the work of political theorist Desmond Jagmohan. But as this example illustrates, Washington had this powerful public platform, right, that his informal constituency didn't. And he had wide latitude to make very powerful claims on behalf of that constituency. He was a regular advisor to President Theodore Roosevelt. And so but he also made a lot of claims that, right, many within his informal constituency would disagree with, right? Notably and famously, W.E.B. Du Bois, who wrote a chapter in Souls of Black Folk of Mr. Booker T. Washington and others, where he raises some serious concerns about Washington's representation, both its substance and the manner by which Washington ascended to the role.
Yeah. Okay. So there's complexities there, kind of, as you say, coming out of the fact that as an informal political representative, he had significant power. And what's kind of striking about those quotes is he really was seeking to speak on behalf of his whole race, right? In the quotes that you just gave us, which is interesting, I suppose. And yeah, he had the power to kind of make concessions. Perhaps there might have been kind of mixed views on what he was saying among that constituency that he was representing at the time. And also there's kind of the question of like how he's viewed in a historical context now. But it does seem like he had some quite tricky ethical territory to negotiate there. Go on.
And just to add, so the first chapter of the book has a section called The Example of Booker T. Washington. So I use this example to try to bring out the many complications of how different audiences come to confer the status of informal political representative, right? Because this happened to Washington over and over again. He was conferred the status of informal political representative by a wide variety of audiences across a long period of time. And so so first he gets he gets this invitation to speak at this exposition. There he is then introduced by Governor Rufus Bullock as the informal political representative for Black Americans. The audience, then he speaks before all of these audiences. They confer the status of informal political representative on him. Later, Presidents Roosevelt and Taft confer the status. And then Du Bois, who is objecting to his manner of representation, confers the status on him by acknowledging he is treated as speaking on behalf of Black Americans, right? But that conferral, right, to getting back to our point about the difference between maybe this descriptive conferral and authorization, Du Bois is not authorizing or endorsing that he is a representative. He is not acknowledging that Washington's in this role. He's saying, this is the person who has this status. And so another thing you can sort of see from that example is how widespread and interactive different cases of audience conferral can be, right? One of the interesting features about the Washington case is that you watch his status sort of build across audiences and across context and sort of crescendo in what I call widespread collective audience conferral, which doesn't always happen, right? So I don't know that when I've conferred the status of IPR for podcasters on you, that's going to take off as, widespread, right? Like that it's going to,
suspect it might not.
but here in the Washington case, I mean, you see it take off for decades, right?
Great. Okay. So I assume you don't think that we should do away with informal representatives or informal political representatives altogether, right? So you've already said you think they're valuable. So yeah, I mean, what then should, if somebody is an informal political representative, like what should they be thinking about? What sort of considerations should they be taking into account?
Can I say something on the point about whether I think they should? You're right. We shouldn't do away with them.
Yeah.
I think that we should have a conversation, right? More express public conversations about the role. But I should also add that I'm more than a little bit skeptical of like the feasibility of getting rid of them. I think it's an inevitable and ineradicable practice in like almost all societies and in any deliberative forum except for small face-to-face committees. I think it's likely to emerge even in fora that some people might have hoped were immune to it. So there's this line in Iris Marion Young's Inclusion and Democracy where she makes a point that I love. She says, direct democracies often cede power to arrogant loudmouths whom no one chose to represent them. And so to some extent, I think informal political representation is going to crop up across societies and across time. And so whether or not, I mean, I happen to think it has many valuable features. I think in addition to that, it's inevitable.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Okay. So I suppose that makes the responsibilities of these people even more important, right? They need to make sure they're getting it right because we're not going to be able to do without them. They have significant power in the kinds of ways that you've said. So so what are the duties of informal political representatives then?
So in the book, I focus on the duties of informal political representatives of oppressed or marginalized groups in particular. And with respect to those representatives, I talk about 4 duties they have to the represented group and its members. And those are consultation, transparency, welcoming criticism, and tolerating dissent.
Okay. So could we maybe talk about some of those in a bit more detail? So the first one you mentioned there was consulting the people. So is that straightforwardly just saying informal political representatives have a duty to consult the people they represent, right? So they shouldn't just be kind of going off and saying things on behalf of these people without consulting them, as far as that's possible.
Yes, and the as far as that's possible is like the important point here, because trying to consult the group is sort of the standard, because many features of the informal political representative relationship to oppressed or marginalized groups is going to confound this consultative requirement, right? So one concern is that it's going to be difficult to consult groups whose memberships are not well defined and for which there aren't established procedures for determining membership. I call this concern group vagueness in the book. Another concern is group size, right? So some groups, as we've talked about, are simply too large for an individual representative to consult each member one by one. So when the group is very large, I suggest that sometimes proxy consultation, right? Consulting intermediaries or en masse consultation, right? Getting a broad sense of the group through their mass public actions, like say participating in a boycott, can take the place of direct one-to-one consultation.
Right.
In addition, there's some groups that are just going to be difficult to consult for other reasons. So for instance, prisoners or disappeared persons are often inaccessible. And so here too, we may think that proxy consultation, either consulting people who have last been in contact with the members of those groups or who were themselves in the past members of those groups, is going to be the best or even only available avenue for consultation.
Right. Okay. Good. And then you also mentioned transparency, right? So there's a duty of transparency. Again, I take it there's going to be practical limits on how transparent you can be, but could you give some examples of how informal political representatives should seek to be transparent to people that they represent?
Sure. Yeah. And this I think can take a variety of forms, right? So can hold meetings like King did in Montgomery, can write public facing letters or op-eds, right? I think it's more common to make a post on a relevant social media platform to have it broadly accessible to a public, including your intended, right? The members of the group to whom you intend to express what you're doing.
Yeah.
But I think there also has to be some flexibility with respect to the content of those transparent disclosures, right? So transparency can sometimes conflict with strategic secrecy needed to prevent outsiders from undermining an informal political representative's plans. So although these representatives have to be transparent with those they represent about the values, aspirations, and goals they pursue on the represented group's behalf, sometimes the planned or implemented strategies for advancing those, goals and values will need to remain undisclosed, at least for a time, in the interest of the effectiveness of the plan itself. So there are, again, these feasibility constraints, but there are also these strategic considerations.
Okay, interesting. I mean, would an example of where those strategic considerations come into play be something like negotiation? So if you're like negotiating on behalf of a group, you might want to keep some of your cards close to your chest, so to speak. So you wouldn't want to kind of give away your negotiating strategy, even if you're trying to be transparent in doing so. You would be inadvertently kind of undermining your own negotiation.
Right. So if is the case you're thinking of is the representative is going into this negotiation, they're concerned that if they have this broad and comprehensive spreadsheet of every move they're going to make
yes, exactly.
in the negotiation, their willingness to publicly share that, right, with the group may have the unintended consequence of sharing it with one's negotiation counterparts. Seems like, so I think that's an example where you want, and you can, I mean, but even in saying that, you can say, well, there might be clear common understanding between the representative and the represented group about the goal that would be acceptable to the represented group. And this gets back to the question of the interest. Let's imagine, right, there is an outcome that it is known that the representative is just not permitted to take on under any circumstance. Seems fine in many contexts for that to be common knowledge to the represented group's members and the representative. Seems like it would be valuable for them to have a common view of what that line in the sand is, right? But beyond that, the manner of negotiation might be better to have that remain under-described or undisclosed, depending on the context, right? Depending on the sensitivity of the context.
Yeah, good. Okay. One of the things that you say that I found really interesting was you said that IPRs have some kind of duty to cultivate non-reliance. So I guess that means that they should be trying to move towards a situation where the group relies on them less, right? Is that what you had in mind? Yeah. Could you say a bit more about what that means and why you think they have that duty?
One of the motivating concerns for the fourth chapter of the book, which is where I discuss all of, sort of the core of these duties, is that there are a variety of sources of inequality between informal political representatives and the oppressed or marginalized groups they represent. One source of this inequality is that some represented groups rely on their informal political representatives for any political influence they hope to have, and their informal political representatives do not correspondingly rely on them. This asymmetry is concerning So, for instance, we might worry that power corrupts, right? An informal representative who is well motivated at the outset may, over time, develop an inflated sense of their own importance or purpose or knowledge. And if this occurs, well-intended deliberative social practices like consultation and transparency are not going to prevent such a representative to falling prey to outsized confidence in their own judgment, even when it conflicts with input from the represented.
Mm.
In addition, even if an informal political representative doesn't succumb to this overinflated confidence in their own judgment, we may still worry that the very fact that the represented rely on a given informal political representative contributes to a relational imbalance between the parties because that reliance is unidirectional. And so the question is, well, how can the represented's reliance be undermined or counteracted? Is there anything that informal political representatives can do early on to tie their own hands? So they can't, for instance, set self-imposed term limits, since one of our concerns is that power corrupts. And so we can't count on informal political representatives to voluntarily step down. In addition, if a good representative is required to step down, the represented might then lose out on the informal representative's knowledge, talent, and skill. And beyond that, some informal political representatives may be stuck in the position despite a preference to step down or to not have been in the position at all. And so how do we meet those concerns? So in the book, I propose that each voluntary informal political representative has a responsibility to promote non-reliance by cultivating competitors and replacements from early on, even if those competitors and replacements have the potential to become the informal political representatives' rivals, right? So deepening that field of competent informal political representatives mitigates the represented's reliance on any particular informal political representative, which undermines one cause of that relational inequality. It also offers informal political representatives a way to prospectively hold themselves accountable by making sure they're not the only game in town. And I want to note that I'm really grateful to political theorist Emily Booth Chapman for pressing me on this and raising this concern. She really emphasized to me the stakes of thinking about this reliance concern in particular and trying to provide a solution to ameliorate it.
Okay, that's really interesting. And do you think that informal political representatives should be trying to make their form of representation more formal? Because I suppose you might think that that's one way of addressing the issues that you've highlighted, right? To kind of get some more formal authority and accountability mechanisms in place and so on. Do you think they should be trying to do that?
You would think so, right? I think if there are all these concerns that emanate from the informality of their role, particularly the absence of procedural protections like authorization and accountability, well, why not think that all representation is made better by being made more formal? In some cases, I think many of the concerns about informal political representation both can and ought to be addressed by working to make informal political representation more formal, but not always. So here's an example about a case where you might think it is both helpful and designed and therefore desirable and also feasible. So you can imagine that a group of workers is acting collectively to improve members' working conditions, and that at some stage of their organizing, the workers judge that particular roles, for instance, addressing shop floor issues and communicating with the boss, should be assigned by means of an election procedure. In cases like this, it's helpful and therefore desirable to the represented group here, the workers, for their representation to become more authorizationally formal. And crucially, it's also feasible that this can take place. But this sort of example, I think, gives the misleading impression that it will always be better if informal political representation be made more formal. However, there will be cases of informal political representation where the aim of working towards formal political representation will be infeasible, undesirable, or both. So let's consider first infeasibility. Some instances of informal political representation will be especially poorly suited to efforts at formalization. So you can consider the Black Lives Matter movement, which informally represents Black Americans. it's a large, decentralized, widely dispersed, represented group that may not be able to incorporate more formal authorization mechanisms like elections because the relevant constituency can't be determined with ease or accuracy, or even if it could, it may be infeasible to carry out a group vote.
Right.
Now, that other consideration is undesirability. So even when it's feasible, efforts to formalize currently informal political representation may be undesirable, right? The implementation, let alone the design of formal systematic structures can be costly, and in some cases can leave the represented worse off than if their informal political representative relationship were left just as it is. So you can consider one cost. Formal political representative institutions often limit the number of representatives a given constituency can have. That's not the case for informal political representation, where in theory, a given constituency can have as many informal political representatives as can receive audience conferral. So one notable cost of making informal political representation more formal is that it places limits on how many representatives a given group can have. And so while it can be useful in some contexts, like the union formation example I discussed, to impose limits on the number of representatives that emerge, I think those limits have their costs. So in some cases, having multiple or even numerous informal political representatives can encourage productive contestation, as those many informal political representatives give voice to the competing perspectives of a large heterogeneous group, thereby undermining that sort of entrenchment of a few more established spokespersons, which can in turn cultivate non-reliance. I think another interesting example of this is that some social movements are valuable precisely because they encourage the emergence of more and more varied informal political representatives. And here I think of the Me Too movement. As its name suggests, right, the movement formed as sexual assault, abuse, and harassment survivors emerged to share their experiences additively. And the parties spoke on their own behalves, publicly announcing the wrongs they'd endured. But we might not unreasonably think that many of these parties also became informal political representatives for the large and widely dispersed group of sexual assault, abuse, and harassment survivors, for many of whose members this public proclamation is unavailable or prohibitively risky. So the numerous survivors who shared their experiences, by their sheer numbers, attested to the utter ordinariness and pervasiveness of sexual assault, abuse, and harassment, which is an outcome that couldn't have been as effectively communicated had there been formal constraints on the number of parties permitted to say Me Too. So I think it's only when it's both feasible and desirable, right? And we can look at cases and kind of decide, is it feasible and desirable to make informal political representation more formal, that the representative and the group have some reason to try to do so.
Great. Yeah. Okay. There's loads more things I could ask you about this, but I think we've pretty much run out of time. So we'll draw a line under it there. So Wendy Salkin, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
It's been such a pleasure talking with you. Thank you for having me.
If you enjoyed this episode of Ethics Untangled, please like and subscribe and recommend us to your friends. The podcast is edited by Mark Smith at Leeds Media Services, and our music is by Kate Wood. Ethics Untangled is brought to you by the Idea Centre, a specialist unit for teaching, research, training and consultancy in applied ethics at the University of Leeds. We offer master's programmes in healthcare ethics and applied and professional ethics, and PhDs available full or part-time and face-to-face or by online learning. We also offer consultancy and training services for business and the professions, including help with the difficult ethical issues faced by your organisation, commissioned research projects, and online or face-to-face CPD. If you'd like to find out more about these or any of our other activities, please visit our website at ahc.leeds.ac.uk/ethics.